There are few images as evocative as those of the deep forest. Canopies that swallow up the sunlight, tree trunks that rise endlessly into the distance. It feels synonymous with being lost, alone, afraid, of being unable to find a straight path amidst the branches and wandering ever further into its depths. This is a primal, ancient nature, untouched by the corrupting hand of civilization, and here we are no longer in control. The deep forest holds a powerful place in the cultural imagination too. Folk tales, myths, horror stories, so many of them find their setting in these dark woodlands. We seem ever in danger of finding something here, should we lose our way. We know there's no such thing as monsters, but in the dark of the woods, between the unfeeling trunks of the trees, another voice seems to whisper, "But what if?" In English, the word wilderness is near synonymous with the forest. According to academic Roderick Fraser-Nash, the adjective wild emerged from Teutonic and Norse languages, and was appended to the Old English word deor, meaning beast. Wilderness, then, is the place of wild beasts, a ragged and untamed answer to the tilled fields and hedgerows of cultivated nature. This is not man's domain, but we might find ourselves asking if this truly is the realm of wild beasts, whether, in crossing the threshold of the tree line, leaving behind the trappings of human society, we risk losing not only our way but ourselves, and regressing to a more primal, animalistic state of mind. Fear of the forest, of woods and wilderness and what they might contain, is visible throughout our history, from 13th century Franciscan friars who feared the thieves that lurked there, to the Puritans that crossed a vast ocean to confront the wilds of New England, to the millions who packed screenings of the Blair Witch Project in the late 1990s. In its darkness, depth and mystery, the forest is rich with symbolic and narrative possibilities. It's home to any number of monsters and spirits, witches and demons, and, at times, other worlds entirely. But what lurks there is not always something foreign to us. In the realm of wild beasts, our own darker aspects are often liable to emerge. European folklore is rich with stories of entities that make the forest their home, and those who wandered too deep into the woods risked finding themselves at the mercy of these creatures. Some might be benevolent in nature, like the fairies of English folklore, in some tellings at least, but few are so well inclined. Like the Corrigan, a creature of Breton folklore which takes the form of a beautiful woman with flashing red eyes. She sings to enthrall the hearts of men before dragging them to a watery death. Or the Scandinavian Askafroa, guardian spirit of the ash tree, whose malicious intent could only be abated by pouring water over the roots of the tree on the morning of Ash Wednesday. Many of these folkloric creatures act as protective spirits, and while they are magical, it feels wrong to call them supernatural, because they are nature made manifest, embodiments of the forest and its environs, and they existed long before we first crossed the tree line and disrupted their peace. In Slavic mythology, one such embodiment is Leshy, sometimes referred to euphemistically by titles like Old Man of the Forest, or simply as he among those who fear even speaking his name. His representations in folklore are wide-ranging and contradictory, but he's most often depicted as a wizened, bearded old man, missing eyebrows and eyelashes, able to change his shape at will, to take the forms of the woodland creatures he protects, or to make himself as tall as the trees through which he strides. And he's a temperamental sort, fond of playing tricks on those who enter his home, these thick, ancient forests of Eastern Europe. He might offer you help if you're a hunter or a shepherd, but be careful not to anger him by swearing, making noise, or mistreating the forest, lest he lead you astray in the dark woods. For all of their power, we know and understand these entities. The folklore that surrounds them tells us how they look, where they live, how they behave, and the threats they pose. And it tells us how we should act towards them, the rules that are to be followed when stepping into their domain. Whether it's calming an angered Leshy by making him laugh, reliably done by putting all of your clothes on backwards and your shoes on the wrong feet, or in the case of the demonic Franconian Bilberry man, warding off any potential attacks by placing an offering of bread and fruit on a stone before entering the forest. There's a ritual element to how we coexist and share the forest with these beings, passed down through the oral folk tradition. At night, no doubt these old-world folk tales of powerful malign spirits in the heart of the forest played on the minds of the early settlers of New England as they peered beyond the tree lines of the dark American woods. There were genuine dangers in these lands, unfamiliar beasts, attacks from the native population on whose homes they trespassed. At times, these seem to meld together in the writings of the period, where the settlers speak of the wilderness in suspicious, frightened tones. One 17th century writer described the American landscape as a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men, with a wild and savage hue. Another speaks of this waste and howling wilderness. A third writes of fiery flying serpents, mounts of leopards and droves of devils, and casts the settlers, surrounded by these wilds, as a flock of sheep amidst 1,000 wolves. Their fears turned inwards too. They worried that they would become, in the words of one 18th century French-American author, regulated by the wildness of their neighbourhood, that their wilderness condition would chip away at their civilised minds and see them slowly regress into animalism, becoming, quite literally, bewildered. Their project was at once a battle against the physical wilderness, and a battle against what one clergyman described as the desolate and outgrown wilderness of human nature. If they were not careful, they may find themselves coming to resemble the wild man of medieval European art and literature, that ubiquitous forest dweller, wielding a club, his body covered in thick fur, his behaviour violent and aggressive. Or indeed, the biblical king Nebuchadnezzar, succumbing to madness at the height of his glory, who was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen. Such biblical stories also loomed large in the minds of the settlers, colouring their understanding and experience of the new landscape. The biblical wilderness is a complex and multifaceted concept, charged with meaning and occurring 249 times in the King James Bible. It is an arid wasteland set in opposition to the verdant Garden of Eden, described in Deuteronomy as a great and terrible place, in Jeremiah as a land of deserts and of pits, a land of drought wherein dwells the shadow of death. But this wasteland is not empty, and home to more than the fiery serpents and scorpions described in Deuteronomy. The entity Azazel, to whom a scapegoat bearing the sins of the ancient Israelites was ritualistically sent, is considered by many in Jewish and Christian traditions to refer to a demon inhabiting the wilderness. However, the wilderness also served as a trial to be overcome in the pursuit of a spiritual purification, comparable to the hardship faced by Moses and his followers in pursuit of the Promised Land, or the temptations of Christ himself while fasting in the desert, and even as a place to be actively sought as shelter from the degraded and lascivious world of the city. One clergyman drew direct parallels between the Puritans and John the Baptist, who withdrew into the wilderness, in this clergyman's words, to take people away from that which might have obstructed their ready and cheerful attendance under his doctrine. The drawings of such biblical parallels by the Puritan settlers was common. Though the verdant American forests in no way resembled the dry, infertile deserts of the Near East, the decision of biblical translators to render the Hebrew word midabar as wilderness brings the two into a linguistic parallel. The wild forests of the Old and New Worlds were charged with the same resonances as the landscape through which the ancient Israelites wandered in exile. One settler speaks directly of the wilderness through which we are passing to the Promised Land, calling these wilds the devil's territories. As well as aligning themselves with figures of the Old Testament, the settlers cast themselves as a holy army bringing God's light to this land in which, one minister and poet wrote, "The sun of righteousness had never made to shine, until the time drew nigh wherein the glorious Lord of hosts was pleased to lead his armies forth into these foreign coasts." They were here to defeat these wilds, to subdue and cultivate them, and create a godly paradise for themselves. Nowhere is the encounter between these settlers and the wilderness better represented than Robert Eggers' The Witch, a New England folktale. The film is immersed in the writings and the mentalities of the period he depicts. The opening speech given by Ralph Ineson's character William has language directly lifted from Minister Samuel Danforth's 1670 sermon, A Brief Recognition of New England's Errand into the Wilderness.
Was it not for the pure and faithful dispensation of the Gospels and the kingdom of God?
So often in forest horror we see the woodland acting as a home for that which has become intolerable to the civilised world, whether justly or unjustly, casting the cultivated and the wild in opposition, and so too in The Witch. Locked in a theological dispute with the government of his plantation, the prideful, arrogant William is cast out into the wilderness with his children and his wife Catherine, and they build a farmstead at the cusp of the tree line. The early Puritan settlers often quoted the command in Genesis to fill the earth and subdue it, and William is no different. The wilderness is something against which he wages war.
We will conquer this wilderness. It will not consume us.
But for all the talk of conquest, of ordering the chaos in which they now reside, the family's fear of the woods is clear to see. Even to enter them is a transgressive act.
Within the wood? You and Mother have always forbade us to set foot there.
And yet their fears are not unfounded. The woods seem to ooze malignancy, and long, cold, lingering shots of them give an overwhelming sense that something fearsome lurks inside. And something does. Samuel, their baby, is whisked away and killed by the witch that inhabits the forest. Then, under her influence and that of the demonic billy goat Black Phillip, nature begins to corrupt around them. Their corn is afflicted with rot. Their eldest daughter Thomasin cracks an egg to reveal a gruesome, dead, half-formed chick. A goat's milk turns to blood. But these aren't just images of corrupted nature, they're corruptions of the family's attempt to subdue and domesticate these wilds, to grow food, to raise livestock. The wilderness shrugs off the family's attempt to civilise it, leaving William to exercise dominion over the woods in the only way he can, ceaselessly chopping the logs he's harvested from them. It's the Witch of the Wood who reigns supreme in this space, and she is everything that organised society disdains. She's an agent of chaos and discord who's broken free of the fetters of the civilised world and sought refuge amidst the wildness. The wilderness condition soon begins to chip at the minds of the family. The fear of the historical Puritans that the wilds would erode the barriers between man and his animal instincts begins to realise itself between the unwavering gaze of the trees.
Our children have been fostered up like savages. How often?
Here they cannot uphold the pure, strict Christian moral ideal they strive for. William and Catherine grow ever more paranoid. Lies are quickly told, unfounded accusations of witchcraft made against Thomasin. We see Caleb, the oldest son, on the cusp of puberty, on several occasions gazing longingly at his sister. Later, lost in the deep woods, he gives himself over to his lust and the seductive wiles of the witch when he happens upon her home. As his family falls apart, his farm fails, and his patriarchal authority cracks, William becomes ever more violent and unhinged. He comes to resemble the violent and brutish medieval wild man as he obsessively splits wood, half naked, or when he threatens to brutalise his young son Jonah in a fit of rage.
Fetch the billow, and I will dash his skull!
What each member of the family had been able to keep repressed within the walls of the plantation, what was squashed down by the repressive Puritan moral codes under which they lived, begins to re-emerge. It's not only the denizens of the deep woods that we have to fear here, but also what lurks within ourselves, what the quiet and isolation of the wilderness gives voice to. The forest provides the backdrop against which our darker natures may take the stage. In the film's final moments, amongst the fresh corpses of her parents, Thomasin embraces the wilderness completely, offering her soul to Black Phillip in exchange for the sensory delights of a life lived deliciously. She sheds her clothes and crosses the border of the forest, departing for the final time the constrained, repressive world that her family had sought to replicate in the wilderness. No longer fearful, she embraces the witch's Sabbath and its promise of a new, freeing, hedonistic existence. The Witch of the Woods, wizened and alone in her house in the deep forest, is an archetypal figure in forest horror, almost synonymous with it. From the deceitful, cannibalistic witch into whose clutches Hansel and Gretel fall, to Baba Yaga, carried through the woods in her chicken-legged hut. What makes a witch so compelling is her humanity. She's retreated from human society, taken refuge in the woods as a wielder of frightening power. But we still see ourselves in her. She is at once of our world and of another. And so too does the witch force a confrontation with our own darker history, of the blend of paranoia, hysteria, religious extremism and misogyny that saw innocent women and girls tortured and executed in East Anglia, Salem, and, in fiction, the small Maryland town of Burkittsville, formerly Blair. The world of the Blair Witch Project is one in which our relationship with the forest and with wilderness has changed unrecognisably from that of the witch. The forest no longer inspires the fear and the dread that it once did. The power dynamics have been inverted. It's no longer an active and present threat. No longer are pockets of civilization surrounded and menaced by the wilderness. Now civilization has the wilderness firmly in its grasp. It's at our mercy, holding on for dear life against the rapacious environmental plundering of modern capitalism. We have subdued the wilderness beyond the dreams of the early American settlers, its very contours measured and inscribed in the pages of geological survey maps. This changed relationship is clear from the film's beginning. There's a carelessness, an arrogance perhaps, in the way its three protagonists, students Heather, Josh and Mike, approach the woods, as they undertake to film a documentary about the local legend of the Blair Witch, and a serial killer of children that she allegedly inspired, Rustin Parr, the latter another child killer, like Egger's witch, for whom the forest provides a home. Armed with little more than a map, some beers, and a book called How to Stay Alive in the Woods, they enter the forest, telling no one where they're going, never to return. But the book alone underscores how sheltered and unfamiliar the students and almost all of us have become from the reality of nature. Staying alive in the woods is a kind of arcane lost knowledge now, something to be packaged and sold back to us in mass market paperbacks. In the film, this becomes evident long before even the suggestion of anything supernatural. The students are unfamiliar with and ill-prepared for the deep woods. These are not the hardened pioneers of centuries past who learned how to survive in these wilds through years of struggle against them. In our societal dominance of the wilderness, we've lost much of our individual capacity to survive it. But the students seem to have confused the former for the latter, only to later discover their error. A modern map is a perfect symbol of this collective dominance, a way for us to exercise control over the landscape, stripping the mystery from it and precisely rendering it legible. It's a shift in perspective from an incomplete one, seen from within, to a complete top-down one, seen from without. But the students can't read the map well enough to take advantage of it. Mike admits that he can't.
This is Greek to me.
Right.
But Heather remains hubristically adamant in her abilities, even after she gets them lost in the very first leg of their trip.
Josh feels it's necessary to look at the map now, even though I know where we're going and we're going straight ahead up there.
If you've known where we're going, we wouldn't be hiking like we're in the middle of the How could you
Some of it is...
As they grow more lost, however, it is to man's collective subjugation of the wilderness that she appeals, citing our destructive mastery of the natural world as a guarantor against their staying lost.
Because this is America and it's not possible. We've destroyed most of our natural resources. Let's just keep going.
But as the physical power of the wilderness begins to reassert itself, so do the folk tales that are, at first, so casually dismissed by the students. As our relationship to the forest has changed, so too has our relationship to the folklore that surrounds it. In an enlightened modern era, stories of powerful entities and shadowy horrors in the woods aren't alive and real for us in the way they were for the family and the witch. The ritual element of our coexistence with the forest denizens has been lost. Stories of the Blair Witch have been reduced to little more than a local curiosity, a spooky tale with which to scare young children, inconsequential fodder for enterprising film students.
Yeah, it's a story my grandmother used to tell us all. Make us go to bed early.
Really?
But as the party spend night after draining night in the forest, the Blair Witch slowly makes her presence known. But she does it in small, incidental ways at first. Piles of stones, arrangements of twigs. However, even as this malign entity becomes more active, she's never seen, and the core of the horror remains the woods themselves and the very real, earthly possibility of being hopelessly lost among them. Exhausted, frightened, dehydrated, walking fruitlessly for hours at a time, unable to tell whether you are now closer to rescue or merely more lost. All the methods through which the students try to master these wilds by imposing a rational order on them fail. They try to read the map, to no avail, before Mike destroys it in what seems like a fit of delirium. The party's then left to rely on a compass, which also proves to be of little use.
How do you feel about East?
How do you feel about East?
Well, South didn't work.
The very topography of the woods seems to warp around them, and they find themselves almost impossibly confronting a creek which they had passed days before. It's never made explicit to what extent this is the work of the witch, or simply the students losing themselves further in their panic and disorientation, or some mixture of both. But as the party tread and retread the same ground, the acts more clearly attributable to the witch become ever more sinister. The laughs of children echo through the forest at night. Josh disappears and Heather discovers parts of his body wrapped in a bundle of twigs. Before long, they find themselves at Rustin Parr's forest cabin where the cameras capture their final moments. They will never escape the woods. At the heart of the Blair Witch Project is a rediscovery of both the physical terror of the forest and what may lurk within it, recalling the fears that played on the minds of those who encountered these same East Coast forests centuries ago. It depicts a shattering of the complacency bred by decades of human exploitation and subjugation of the wilds, and a reassertion of the power of the wilderness over those who might erroneously consider themselves its master. And that rediscovery was not limited to the film's characters. It was made in cinemas across the United States and the world, amongst those who'd been convinced that what the film depicted was genuine, newly alive to the possibility of something supernatural lurking in the woods of Maryland, thanks in no small part to an ingenious marketing campaign that leaned heavily into the film's claims of authenticity. The Blair Witch Project refigures some of the conventions of the witch story. Here we're one step removed from the classic Witch of the Woods, and one step further into the supernatural. The Blair Witch isn't a witch in the traditional sense. She's the ghost of a woman accused of witchcraft in the 18th century and left to die in the forest. But some recognisable constants remain. In both The Witch and The Blair Witch Project, the forest is a space into which those deemed unacceptable to the neighbouring society are cast, and which provides shelter for transgressive or immoral acts, notably infanticide in both cases. In both instances too, the entity faced by the protagonist has a human dimension, is of our world so to speak, whether it's a human witch or the ghost of one. But elsewhere we can see the forest acting as a site for an encounter with something truly unknown, which defies neat categorization into our established taxonomy of mythical forest dwellers and supernatural or paranormal entities. Here the woods become a threshold between our world and another. In his book The Weird and the Eerie, cultural theorist Mark Fisher describes the weird in terms of a meeting of disparate worlds, the emergence of something into our world which does not belong there. Worlds may be entirely foreign to ours, he writes, without being weird. It is the eruption into this world of something from outside which is the marker of the weird. Such an eruption requires a site, a space in which to occur, and Fisher notes that weird fiction always presents us with a threshold between worlds, and that the centrality of doors, thresholds and portals means that the notion of the between is crucial to the weird. So often in works of forest horror, it's the woods that act as this between space, where the veil between two worlds wears so thin as to become transparent, and we're confronted with something that defies our understanding. Algernon Blackwood's 1907 novella The Willows is a classic work of forest horror. Two men undertake a canoe expedition along the Danube. Seeking respite from the rough, tempestuous waters, they land on a small island in the river, covered in willow bushes. The sublime landscape, the thundering waters, all serves to remind the narrator and his companion of their insignificance before the raw force of nature. But there's one particular aspect of this lonesome island that inspires dread in the narrator. Apart quite from the elements, he says, the willows connected themselves subtly with my malaise, attacking the mind insidiously somehow by reason of their vast numbers, and contriving in some way or another to represent to the imagination a new and mighty power. A power, moreover, not altogether friendly to us. Confronting the masses of willows, which appear to possess a spirit of their own, the narrator muses on the curious and unwelcome suggestion that we had trespassed here upon the borders of an alien world, a world where we were intruders, a world where we were not wanted or invited to remain. But his concern does not give way to outright fear, not quite yet, even after they encounter a stranger on a raft in the river who appears to be shouting warnings at them. These are rational men, experienced adventurers after all. But as darkness draws in, the dread that the willows inspires becomes harder to shake off. We touch the frontier of a region where our presence was resented, the narrator says. For a night's lodging we may perhaps be tolerated, but for a prolonged and inquisitive stay, no. By all the gods of the trees and the wilderness, no. We were the first human influences upon this island, and we were not wanted. The willows were against us. This is true wilderness, untouched and unspoiled by human presence, and home to something that does not take such a presence kindly. The narrator tries to rationalise these thoughts as bizarre fancies. This modern post-Enlightenment man continually seeks to find ways to explain away his fears, even as the horrors become harder and harder to deny. He sees a mass of bronze humanoid shapes shifting above the willow bushes, and he awakes to find that the willows seem to have inched closer to him overnight. An explanation of some kind was an absolute necessity, he reflects, just as some working explanation of the universe is necessary, however absurd, to the happiness of every individual who seeks to do his duty in the world and face the problems of life. Their situation continues to degrade. Their canoe is damaged in the night, their steering paddle is nowhere to be found, their food supplies disappear. The narrator desperately reaches for rational explanations, but his companion sees through the bluster, telling him that this feeble attempt at self-deception only makes the truth harder when you're forced to meet it. These protagonists are far more capable and far less complacent than those of the Blair Witch Project, but once again we see the post-Enlightenment mindset falter in the face of the horrors that call these wilds their home. The men regress to a more primal, fearful understanding of this wilderness. Both men offer a suggestion for what might explain what they encounter. The narrator considers the possibility that it's a production of disrupted elements, his companion that they have happened upon some ancient sacred grove, but they both make the mistake of looking to their own world for this explanation. The forces of the island are not so easily apprehended. It's not the willows themselves that stalk them, they are simply avatars for the true power that lurks there. A far cry from fairies, leshies and witches, this power is in no way defined by its relationship with humanity. It has no relationship to humanity at all. All my life, says the narrator's partner, I have been strangely, vividly conscious of another region, where immense and terrible personalities hurry by, intent on vast purposes compared to which earthly affairs, the rise and fall of nations, the destinies of empires, the fate of armies and continents are all as dust in the balance. We happen to have camped in a spot, he says, where their region touches ours. Even thinking about these forces, he says, draws them closer and heightens the possibility of their being found and taken. These are not like the forest denizens of folklore, whose behaviour is understood, dictated by conventions and rules. Any notion of their intentions and motivations, the ethical or moral codes that govern them, is merely speculative on our part. These are an immense and horrifying unknown, to whom the two men on the island are little more than mosquitoes on a warm evening, minor irritants. Our insignificance, says the narrator's companion, perhaps may save us. The narrator's lifelong conception of the world, its bounds and limits, has suddenly exploded outwards. Earlier he talked about the necessity of some working explanation of the universe, but any such explanation is annihilated in the face of these events, as he discovers himself to be a mere atom in a universe more complex, inhabited, and frightening than he ever thought before. The surging river reminded him that man is barely master of his own world. This island within the river has revealed that man is in fact smaller and more powerless than he ever imagined. And, all the more subtly terrifying, these forces have been going about their business completely unnoticed, perhaps for millennia before they were discovered here, completely by chance, at a point where our two worlds happen to merge. And who can say what might follow their newfound awareness of this threshold, prompted by the arrival of two adventurers? This is not wilderness that can be subdued, as was the desire of the New World settlers. This is wilderness home to powers that could obliterate us with a careless flick of the wrist. We're liable to feel insignificant amidst the majesty and scale of the wild, as indeed the narrator does in the novella's opening pages. But the Willows takes this insignificance and transposes it to a much vaster, cosmic scale. Like the Blair Witch Project, the Willows depicts a rediscovery of a terror of the wilds, but distinguishes itself by doing so through a discovery of something new. In The Witch and the Blair Witch Project, we see a realisation of our fears of the forests, familiar stories of witches and ghosts brought to life. Here we discover that our fears were far smaller and more narrow than they should have been, never coming close to doing justice to the true scale of the lurking horror. Through its embodiment of the weirdness that Fisher describes, the story expands the possibilities of just what the wilds might be home to. In Blackwood's construction, these otherworldly forces in the forest are isolated and not in contact with the human world. To see something of the inverse where they're closely bound up with the actions and fates of humans, we need only cast our eye to the pine woods of the Pacific Northwest. In the small Washington town of Twin Peaks, homecoming Queen Laura Palmer is found dead. An eccentric FBI agent, Dale Cooper, is dispatched to lead on the case. As he investigates, he peels back the layers of the seemingly postcard-perfect town to reveal its hidden darkness. Drug deals, sex trafficking, domestic violence, and Laura's secret life, one of addiction, exploitation, abuse, ignored by the town and left to run its course to its brutal conclusion. Created by Mark Frost and David Lynch in 1990, Twin Peaks is a frighteningly complex property to write about, thanks in no small part to its extraordinary 18-part revival series. But here we'll only be speaking about the show's original 2 seasons and the feature film Fire Walk with Me, and taking these pieces on their own terms. The forest holds myriad and contradictory significances within Twin Peaks. It's wound into the fibres of the town's very being. The show's opening sequence is dominated by the Packard sawmill. The interiors, whether the Great Northern Hotel, the Sheriff's Station or the Roadhouse Bar, richly feature wood. The forest and its products define the town, quite literally they hold it together. For Cooper, the sharply dressed city slicker, the trees are a source of wonder.
What kind of fantastic trees have you got growing around here?
For the town's drug trade, it's a place for midnight liaisons, for threats and exchanges, a shelter from the watchful eyes of the town's law enforcement. And it is, of course, the site of Laura's murder. On the day of her death, Laura records a message for her psychiatrist, Dr. Jacoby, where she talks about getting lost in the woods.
I just know I'm gonna get lost in those woods again tonight. I just know it.
That night, with her secret lover, James Hurley, she sees something in the trees and screams. Laura's years of suffering reach their crescendo. James naively pleads with her, but it's far too late. There's no saving Laura, and she runs into the woods, never to return alive. Like Rustin Parr, her killer does his work behind the tree line. Laura and the woods are inextricably bound together. In a video describing his composition of Laura's theme, Angelo Badalamenti recalls Lynch describing an image of Laura in the deep woods as they developed the music together.
Then he would say, "Okay, Angelo, now we gotta make a change, because from behind a tree in the back of the woods, there's this very lonely girl Her name is Laura Palmer, and it's very sad, but get something that matches her.
Visually, the depictions of the forest at times reflect all of these perspectives. The woods can be cold, misty, sublime, or warmly lit, bright, comfortable. And then there are the times where a single lone flashlight beam barely illuminates the thick, oppressive darkness. The forests hum with power here. The very wood itself speaks. The log lady, reminiscent of a witch of the woods, dwells alone in her cabin at the edge of the forest, offering cryptic messages from her log for those willing to hear, a kind of conduit between the woods and the town. But there are far darker things beneath the canopy too. Early in the show, the town sheriff, Harry S. Truman, acknowledges a powerful ancient force within the woods around the town.
There's a sort of evil out there. Something very, very strange in these old woods.
Aspects of this presence make themselves known throughout the original run, all seeming to revolve around a red curtained place with a zigzagging floor, first seen by Cooper in a dream and later given a name, the Black Lodge. The lodge is of another world, inhabited by strange, backwards talking beings, but Glastonbury Grove, deep in the heart of the woods, is the point at which the veil is thin enough to permit a crossing. Like in the Willows, we cannot understand the lodge's inhabitants in the way we can a witch, or a fairy, or leshy. There are no tomes of folklore to which we can turn, no encyclopedia that neatly maps out how to anger or calm these spirits. The closest we come, perhaps, to an outright explanation is when Native American Deputy Sheriff Hawk shares the local mythology surrounding these places.
My people believe that the White Lodge is a place where the spirits that rule man and nature here reside.
It's a local legend. Goes way back.
There is also a legend of a place called the Black Lodge, the shadow self of the White Lodge.
But these explanations sit uneasily with the reality of what's depicted. The White Lodge is never explicitly shown, and dismissing all of the Black Lodge spirits as simply evil overlooks much of their complexity. For the most part, their motivations and the precise nature of their relationships with each other are inscrutable, and they seem happy to involve humans in their schemes as they offer assistance to Cooper on several occasions, even if they only do so cryptically. Hawke's description feels like a flawed human attempt to grasp something much beyond our comprehension. There's an entire world in motion beyond the sycamore trees of Glastonbury Grove, but we must make do with frustratingly disparate snapshots of it. Part of what makes these encounters with the truly otherworldly so unsettling and compelling is precisely the fact that these entities evade our attempts to understand and taxonomize them. There are clues to be found and connections to be made, no doubt, but the full picture remains ever elusive. Embracing the ambiguity is an important part of engaging with Twin Peaks. We long to see behind the thick red curtain, but at best it may flutter for a moment and permit us a glimpse. What is clear, however, is that here we have something different. In all of the other pieces we've discussed, the influence of the presences in the woods does not extend beyond the forest borders and into civilization. Here this is no longer the case, and they actively intervene within the world beyond the tree line. And nowhere is this more clearly seen than the figure known only as Bob, an inhabiting spirit from the Black Lodge. In the second season, it's revealed that Laura's father, Leland, was Laura's murderer, and he had abused her for years, all the while possessed by the spirit of Bob, who fed for years on her pain and suffering. The mystery is solved, but it doesn't feel like a resolution. In his dying moments, Leland protests his innocence, claiming he didn't know what was being done when Bob was in control, that he was nothing but an innocent host for this dark spirit. But it's difficult to dismiss the suspicion that things are not quite so clear-cut, and the possibility remains that Bob was simply some kind of abstraction, an avatar of Leland's darker nature, a means through which he could compartmentalise his actions and maintain the image of a hard-working small-town lawyer. That's the conclusion reached by Cooper's colleague, FBI forensic specialist Albert Rosenfield, that Bob is simply an expression of our own evil.
Maybe that's all Bob is. The evil that men do.
And Albert's thesis seems to be vindicated when we reach Fire Walk with Me, where Leland himself takes on a notably more horrifying aspect. the human part of this dark symbiosis is emphasised far more than the supernatural. Whether Bob is an active influence or merely a silent passenger is still left unclear, but Leland's innocence seems ever harder to argue. As the show's name suggests, doubles and mirrors are key motifs in Twin Peaks. The association of Bob with mirrors is particularly strong, evidence perhaps for the notion that Bob is simply a reflection of something already present in those whom he inhabits. But this exploration of the hidden darknesses in people, this exhumation of what they keep repressed, is not limited to Leland. Explaining the mythology of the Black Lodge, Hawke describes the doppelgangers it contains.
There, you will meet your own shadow self.
Shadow selves that must be confronted with perfect courage on the path to the White Lodge.
If you confront the Black Lodge with imperfect courage, it will utterly annihilate your soul.
The doppelganger forces a confrontation with the darker aspects of the self. After all, in The Witch, the forest was a space in which that which had previously been stuffed away was brought to the surface. But here, deep in the woods of Twin Peaks, we go beyond the metaphysical, and what was hidden away is given a corporeal form. These are otherworldly beings, yes, but otherworldly beings created from the human, from repressed thoughts, impulses, desires. They are the evil that men do, or that perhaps they only conceal, given form. After Laura's death, the town itself faces a similar confrontation with what it had tried to hide away. Her murder pierces through its veneer of cosy small-town life. Its repressed secrets are brought into stark and undeniable relief, and the rot that is eaten to its core is exposed. At Laura's funeral, her boyfriend Bobby rages at the assembled townspeople.
You damn hypocrites make me sick! Everybody knew she was in trouble, but we didn't do anything. All you good people. You want to know who killed Laura? You did! We all did.
The town knew that Laura was suffering, knew of the abuse she faced at the hands of its predatory men, but it was happy to turn a blind eye. Even if Leland were a perfectly innocent vessel, the evil would still not belong to Bob alone. He could not have thrived without the evil that men do. In their willful ignorance, the townspeople provided Bob with fertile ground in which to feed, unaccountable, for years, and they are every bit as responsible as he is. Within the world of Twin Peaks, these otherworldly forces are real, in some form or another. It feels disingenuous to try and dismiss the supernatural elements as purely an expression of the town and its darkness. But at the same time, they are used to turn a mirror onto the characters, the town, and ourselves. Like the titular mountains, these two poles coexist. And in this coexistence, Fisher's notion of the weird ceases to feel appropriate. We have all the ingredients, an encounter between worlds and a curtained threshold in the heart of the forest. But these two worlds are not as disparate as we might like to think. The lodge and its spirits are too bound up with the human, quite literally in the case of Bob. At both a societal and individual level, they affect a confrontation with the unvarnished reality of ourselves, what we dare not express or even acknowledge. And it's no small ask to face one's own darkness. In the final episode of the original run, eye to eye with his doppelganger, Agent Cooper flinches and is trapped in the lodge for 25 years. We can never rediscover the relationships held with the forest, with woods and wilderness, by those who came long before us. The medieval Europeans for whom the beings of folklore, pixies, elves and leshy were very much alive and real. The settlers that arrived on the American coast in the 17th century. As Heather implies in the Blair Witch Project as she notes the mass destruction of natural resources in the United States, the balance of power between civilization and the wild has been turned on its head. And in a world of GPS and the Ordnance Survey, the forest is not the fearsome unknown it once was. We could even go so far as to call vast swathes of the modern wilderness a kind of simulation. In his 1981 work Simulacra and Simulation, French philosopher Jean Baudrillard describes the decision of the Philippine government in the 1970s to return the few dozen Tassidae indigenous people, who had just been discovered in the depths of the jungle, where they had lived for 8 centuries without any contact with the rest of the species, to their primitive state, out of the reach of colonizers, tourists, and ethnologists. This was because, he argues, the anthropologists were seeing the indigenous people disintegrate immediately upon contact, like mummies in the open air. For the anthropologists and ethnologists, in Baudrillard's formulation, the Tassidae had lost something in their being contacted by the wider world. Their purity as an object of ethnological study had been sullied. Their return was therefore, in essence, an act of attempted undiscovery, an effort to return them to their previous, uncontacted state. But this is, of course, merely a simulation. The genie is out of the bottle and cannot be so easily returned. As Baudrillard states, and please excuse the outdated language, the Tassidae become the model of simulation for all the possible Indians from before ethnology. There's a parallel to be drawn between this model of simulation and parts of the modern wilderness, I think, where once it was authentically wild, vast swathes of it untamed and unconquered. It's now something that, in the West at least, is specifically defined and protected by the very civilization it once opposed, through legislative acts and EU directives, managed by park services and forestry commissions, these being all that stands between these landscapes and the business interest that would plunder them without a second thought. In what seems like an impossible contradiction, we cordon off areas and declare them wild. But this wildness is no longer intrinsic to the space. It is, ironically, cultivated in its own way. And there's perhaps no better illustration of this than the concept of rewilding or reforesting, civilization deliberately attempting to restore to a space the wildness that it once stripped from it. The space has been returned to wildness the same way the Tassidae were returned to an uncontacted state. Nevertheless, as the Blair Witch Project shows, it's important not to confuse this paradigm shift with an ability for man to surmount these wild spaces at the individual level. They continue to present myriad dangers to the unprepared explorer, losing one's way beneath the canopy, death by starvation, dehydration, injury. In both its mystery and its danger, the wild forest retains its power to captivate and enthrall. In horror, the woods provide a home for that which does not belong, for religious dissidents who have fallen foul of their settlements' moral and authoritative frameworks, for witches and child killers who refuse to be bound by such frameworks altogether, for entities from somewhere else entirely, from beyond our world and beyond our understanding. But the terror does not solely come from without. Beyond the tree line and the clutch of the civilized world, we risk unwanted truths about ourselves beginning to emerge. The desires we've kept repressed, the aspects of ourselves and our communities that we've tried to deny, the reality of our absolute insignificance in the face of nature and the cosmos. The forest at once permits an encounter with the otherworldly, with powerful beings with whom we trifle at our own peril. Figures we might know and understand, and figures we can only hope to. And, as those early American settlers feared, an encounter with certain aspects of ourselves, our darker sides in both figurative and literal form. However our relationship with this landscape has changed, the ancient darkness in these woods remains, its shape ever shifting, but at times seeming uncomfortably familiar.